The most dangerous creatures in the galaxy are never the ones wearing chains. The war chamber of the dreadnought Obsidian Crown vibrated with the deep mechanical pulse of its engines as it drifted above the burning moon of Karos Prime. Red emergency lights swept across polished black steel walls every few seconds, painting the room in flashes of crimson like an open wound breathing in the dark. The smell of overheated circuitry mixed with cold recycled air and the bitter scent of alien incense burning from silver bowls near the throne platform. More than 300 officers stood in absolute silence beneath towering holograms of fleet formations and casualty reports. No one moved. No one even blinked when Lady Valeth entered the chamber. She was nearly 7 feet tall, her deep blue-violet skin glowing beneath the tactical displays overhead. Black ceremonial armor wrapped around her body like sharpened obsidian, lined with dark crimson patterns that shifted faintly whenever she moved. Her golden eyes scanned the room with the detached calm of someone born to command wars before learning how to speak. Behind her walked a single human male wearing a black inhibitor collar around his throat. Ethan Cole, 6'4", broad shoulders, white skin covered in faded scars that disappeared beneath the sleeves of his gray security uniform. His dark hair was cropped short. His face carried no anger, no fear, just exhaustion carved so deeply into his expression it almost looked permanent. The room grew colder the moment he stepped inside. Several alien officers lowered their eyes instinctively. One young lieutenant swallowed hard at the sight of the scars climbing above the human's collar line like pale fractures across stone. Valeth noticed. Her lip curled slightly. "Pathetic," she said softly. Her voice echoed through the chamber with unnatural clarity. A Deathworld species reduced to carrying weapons for its betters. Ethan remained still behind her throne platform, hands folded behind his back exactly as protocol demanded. The fleet commander beside the throne activated a tactical display showing the latest rebellion zones near the outer colonies. 3. Settlements refuse surrender, he announced carefully. They are requesting diplomatic terms from the Terran Union. At the word Terran, several officers glanced uneasily toward Ethan. The human did not react. Valeth noticed that too. Slowly, she turned toward him. "Look at me, human." Ethan raised his eyes. Calm gray, empty as winter skies. Valeth stepped closer until she stood inches from his face. The chamber became so silent that even the low electrical hum from the holograms seemed deafening. "Your species built its reputation on violence," she said quietly. "Yet here you stand wearing a leash." Then she spat directly across his cheek. A collective tension swept through the chamber like a pressure wave. Several officers immediately looked away. One technician actually took a small step backward. Ethan did not move. The saliva slid slowly down the scar beneath his left eye. He simply reached up with one rough hand and wiped it away using the sleeve of his uniform. No anger. No humiliation. Somehow that was worse. Valeth narrowed her glowing eyes. "Do you feel nothing?" Ethan's voice was low and steady, almost tired. "I feel the ship drifting 3 degrees starboard because your port stabilizers are overheating." The bridge officers froze. Valeth's expression hardened instantly. One commander rushed to his console, his claws moving frantically across the controls before his face paled. "My lady, he is correct." A faint vibration suddenly rolled beneath the floor panels exactly as Ethan had described. The silence that followed felt heavier than gravity itself. Valeth studied the human carefully now, as if seeing him for the first time. Ethan lowered his hand again and returned to stillness beside the throne. Just another obedient guard in gray, clothing beneath red lights. But something had changed in the room. The officers no longer looked at him with amusement. They looked at him the way prey animals watch distant thunder over dark mountains. Valeth slowly turned away, refusing to acknowledge the unease tightening in her chest. "Prepare the fleet for atmospheric descent," she ordered coldly. "And someone repair those stabilizers before this vessel embarrasses me further." As the officers scrambled into motion, Ethan quietly resumed his place behind the throne without another word. Yet deep beneath the Obsidian Crown, somewhere far below the polished decks and military banners, warning sirens suddenly flickered to life for less than half a second before vanishing again into silence. Ethan heard it immediately. His eyes shifted slightly toward the lower sectors of the ship. The old instincts returned faster than breathing. Somewhere in the dark beneath their feet, something had just woken up. The Obsidian Crown descended through the ash clouds of Karos Prime with a low metallic groan that echoed through every deck of the warship. Outside the reinforced observation windows, storms of black dust rolled across the dead moon, like tidal waves swallowing entire mountain ranges. Lightning flashed beneath the clouds in pale blue veins, illuminating the hull of the massive dreadnought for brief, terrifying seconds before darkness consumed it again. Ethan stood alone near the cargo lift junction on Deck 12 while hundreds of crew members rushed through the surrounding corridors carrying crates of weapons, fuel cells, and medical supplies. Steam hissed from exposed vents overhead. Emergency lights continued blinking every few seconds after the stabilizer malfunction. Nobody spoke to the human guard as they passed him. Most did not even look at him anymore. The silence around him had become its own warning. A pair of young alien soldiers approached the checkpoint carrying pulse rifles across their armored chests. One of them slowed slightly as he passed Ethan. "Is it true?" The younger soldier whispered nervously to his partner. "About Varkos 9? The older one immediately grabbed his shoulder. "Do not say that name near him." Ethan said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the dark cargo corridor ahead. Deep below the deck plates, he could still feel the faint vibration from earlier. Too rhythmic to be engine failure. Too controlled to be random movement. Something alive. Somewhere beneath containment. A sharp electronic tone suddenly echoed through the corridor speakers. "Security teams report to lower cargo sectors immediately." Repeat. "Security teams to lower cargo sectors." The surrounding workers immediately stopped moving. Fear spread faster than sound. Ethan slowly turned toward the nearest wall display. A containment warning flashed red across the monitor for half a second before vanishing under a fleet insignia override. Someone was suppressing the alert. His jaw tightened slightly. Then heavy footsteps echoed behind him. Lady Valeth approached with 4 royal guards surrounding her in polished black armor. Her crimson cape shifted softly behind her as she walked through the steam-filled corridor with the calm confidence of a ruler who had never truly feared anything in her life. Until today. Her golden eyes locked onto Ethan immediately. "You heard the alarm," she said coldly. Ethan nodded once. Deck 19. One of her officers frowned. The warning was erased before location data became public. Ethan finally looked at him. The vibration pattern changed. Whatever broke containment is moving upward through the maintenance shafts. The officer went pale beneath his gray skin. Valeth studied Ethan carefully again. It bothered her now how quickly he noticed things nobody else could sense. The human was standing perfectly still, yet somehow looked more alert than the armed soldiers around him. Like a hunting animal listening to distant thunder. "What escaped?" Valeth asked quietly. Ethan's eyes shifted briefly toward the floor beneath them. "You already know." For the first time since entering the corridor, uncertainty crossed her face. Small, almost invisible, but real. One of the royal guards activated a holographic tablet with shaking hands. "My lady, there was classified cargo transferred aboard 3 days ago from the outer research colonies." Valeth turned sharply toward him. "I did not authorize biological weapons on my ship." "The High Council did," the guard answered carefully. "It was meant for arena testing." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Just 1 second. Like a man hearing an old nightmare return after years of silence. Valeth noticed the movement immediately. "You recognize it?" Ethan opened his eyes again. Calm gray beneath the red. "Emergency lights. I survived one before." Silence swallowed the corridor. Even the engine vibrations suddenly felt distant. One of the younger guards let out a nervous breath. "That is impossible." Ethan looked at him without emotion. Most survivors said the same thing. Then the lights went out. Total darkness slammed across the corridor without warning. Several crew members gasped somewhere nearby. Metal groaned deep within the ship. The emergency backup system struggled for 3 long seconds before dim crimson lights flickered back online. And in that brief silence between darkness and light, something massive moved inside the ventilation shafts above them. Slow, heavy, watching. Ethan's head tilted slightly upward. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Everyone needs to leave this deck now." Nobody argued with Ethan after that. Fear moved through the corridor faster than military discipline ever could. Crew members abandoned supply crates where they stood and hurried toward the nearest lifts, while warning sirens finally began pulsing across the lower decks in slow mechanical bursts. The red emergency lights painted every face the same color as fresh rust. Somewhere deep inside the ventilation network above them, metal groaned again. Long, slow, like pressure-bending steel from the inside. Ethan stepped away from the wall and scanned the corridor intersections with quiet focus. His movements were controlled, economical, almost unnaturally calm compared to the panic building around him. One of the royal guards raised his pulse rifle with trembling hands toward the ceiling vent. "Can those things track heat signatures?" Ethan answered without looking at him. "They track fear faster." The guard lowered the rifle slightly after that. Lady Valeth folded her arms beneath her dark cape, refusing to show unease in front of her soldiers. But Ethan could hear the subtle shift in her breathing now. Faster than before. "Seal the lower decks," she ordered sharply. "Lock every maintenance shaft leading upward." Her officers immediately activated wall consoles. Holographic maps flooded the corridor in glowing blue grids while blast doors throughout the ship began, slamming shut one sector at a time. Heavy metallic echoes rolled through the dreadnought like distant thunder. For a brief moment, it almost sounded under control. Then the lights flickered again. One section of the holographic map vanished entirely. Deck 17. Then another. Deck 16. The blue grids disappeared one by one as something moved upward through the sealed sectors anyway. "Impossible," one technician whispered. "Those doors are reinforced Titan steel." Ethan finally spoke again. "It learns." The corridor became silent after that. Valeth slowly turned toward him. "You keep speaking as though you know this creature personally." Ethan's gray eyes stayed fixed on the dark ventilation shaft overhead. "I know what happens when people think cages make them safe." Before she could respond, a sharp metallic impact exploded somewhere above them. Everyone flinched instinctively. Dust rained down from the ceiling panels. Another impact followed immediately after. Closer this time. The younger soldiers backed away from the vent opening near the corridor junction. One of them muttered a prayer beneath his breath in an alien dialect Ethan did not recognize. Valeth noticed the fear spreading through her command staff and stepped forward coldly. "Maintain formation," she snapped. "You are officers of the Dominion, not frightened hatchlings." Her words steadied some of them. Not all. Ethan watched the ceiling in complete silence for several seconds before reaching slowly toward the inhibitor collar around his throat. The black metal device hummed faintly beneath his fingertips. "This collar," he said quietly. "How strong is the override lock?" Valeth frowned immediately. "Strong enough." Ethan lowered his hand again. "Then pray it stays powered." Another impact thundered through the ventilation shaft directly overhead. Louder now. Close enough to vibrate the floor beneath their boots. Then came the sound that froze everyone in place. Not a roar. Not a scream. Breathing. Deep. Slow. Massive lungs drawing air through metal tunnels somewhere above their heads. One crew member dropped his data tablet by accident. The sharp crack against the floor echoed through the corridor like a gunshot. Silence followed. Absolute silence. Even the breathing stopped. Ethan's expression changed for the first time since the alarms began. Not fear. Recognition. "Do not move," he whispered. Nobody did. The emergency lights flickered weakly overhead, while steam curled from broken vents along the walls. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward the dark opening above them. Then a small sound drifted through the corridor from somewhere behind the sealed blast doors farther down the hall. A child crying. Soft. Terrified. Every officer looked toward the sound immediately. Valeth's eyes narrowed. "There are civilians still aboard this deck?" One of the technicians swallowed hard. "Maintenance families, my lady. Some refused evacuation before descent." Ethan was already walking toward the sound before anyone finished speaking. Valeth stepped directly into his path. "You will remain here." Ethan stopped inches from her. Red lights swept across the scars on his face, while distant thunder shook the hull around them. "If the creature heard that child," he said quietly, "then we have less than 2 minutes." For the first time since meeting him, Lady Valeth saw something in the human's eyes that frightened her more than the creature in the vents. Not rage. Not panic. Certainty. The crying echoed again through the sealed corridor ahead of them. Small. Fragile. Terrified. Ethan moved first. He stepped around Lady Valeth without waiting for permission, his boots striking the steel floor with calm, deliberate rhythm while alarm sirens pulsed overhead in slow intervals. Two royal guards immediately raised their rifles toward him. "Stop the human," one barked nervously. Valeth lifted a hand before either soldier could move. Her golden eyes remained fixed on Ethan's back as he approached the locked blast door at the end of the corridor. Steam curled around him beneath the flickering emergency lights, turning his shadow into something larger against the metal walls. The crying continued beyond the sealed barrier. Ethan placed one rough hand against the cold steel door and closed his eyes briefly, listening, feeling. The entire ship seemed to vibrate around him. Now, distant mechanical groans. Pressure shifts inside the ventilation network. Tiny movements hidden beneath the roar of engines and sirens. Then his eyes opened again. "It is above them," he said quietly. One of the officers stared at the ceiling in horror. "How can you possibly know that?" Ethan did not answer. Valeth stepped closer instead, her dark armor reflecting the pulsing crimson lights. "Open the door," she ordered. "My lady, the sector is compromised." A technician protested immediately. "If the organism breaches containment there, open it." The blast door mechanisms hissed loudly as massive locks disengaged one by one. Heavy steel plates slowly separated with a grinding metallic sound that echoed through the corridor like thunder. Warm air rushed out from the maintenance sector carrying the scent of oil, overheated wiring, and smoke. Beyond the doorway stretched a narrow service hall lined with exposed pipes and dim maintenance lights flickering weakly overhead. Near the far end of the corridor, huddled beside a fallen supply cart, sat a small alien child no older than 7. Pale blue skin, thin silver hair, tears streaking down both cheeks. The child looked up the moment the blast door opened. "Please," she cried softly. "Please help my mother." Ethan stepped forward instantly. Then the sound came again. Above them, slow metal bending somewhere inside the ventilation shaft overhead. Every soldier in the corridor froze. Ethan looked up immediately. The maintenance lights flickered twice. Valeth saw his entire body tense beneath the gray uniform for the first time since the alarms began. Not panic. Calculation. "Get the child out," he said calmly. "Now." One of the guards hurried forward toward the crying girl while the others covered the ceiling vents with shaking rifles. Valeth remained beside Ethan near the entrance. "You are speaking as if this thing hunts intelligently." Ethan's eyes stayed fixed upward. "It does." A loud scraping noise dragged across the ceiling directly above the child. The little girl screamed and covered her head. The young guard sprinted the last few feet toward her just as the vent above them buckled inward with a violent metallic crunch. Nobody clearly saw what moved inside the darkness beyond the broken vent. Only motion. Fast. Massive. Wrong. The guard stumbled backward in panic, dropping his rifle across the floor as every light in the hallway flickered violently. Several soldiers opened fire toward the ceiling without waiting for orders. Bright pulses of blue energy illuminated the narrow corridor in chaotic flashes while smoke poured from shattered pipes overhead. Ethan moved through the confusion instantly, not toward the danger, toward the child. He reached her just as another heavy impact slammed through the upper ventilation system. The entire corridor shook beneath their feet. Ethan pulled the terrified girl against his chest and dropped behind the overturned supply cart while burning sparks rained from the ceiling above them. Valeth stared in disbelief. Every trained soldier had fired at the shadows first. The human had protected the child first. The distinction struck her harder than the alarms screaming through the ship. Another metallic howl echoed through the maintenance shafts overhead before the movement suddenly retreated deeper into the darkness. Silence followed. Thick smoke drifted beneath the flashing emergency lights while soldiers slowly lowered their rifles with trembling hands. Ethan remained crouched beside the frightened child, one scarred hand gently covering the back of her head while she cried against his shoulder. His expression never changed. Calm, focused, protective. Valeth could not stop staring at him. Then one of the older officers near the corridor entrance whispered words that immediately chilled the entire room. "That is not possible." Nobody answered him. The officer's eyes remained locked on Ethan with growing fear. The stories from Varkos 9 said the same thing. Smoke drifted slowly through the maintenance corridor while the emergency lights continued their endless pulse of red across steel walls and frightened faces. Nobody spoke for several long seconds after the movement vanished back into the ventilation network. The only sound came from the little girl, crying softly against Ethan's chest while distant warning sirens echoed through the lower decks of the Obsidian Crown. Ethan remained crouched beside the overturned supply cart, one hand steady against the child's back, while his eyes scanned the dark ceiling vents overhead. Calm. Watching. Waiting. Lady Valeth stood motionless near the corridor entrance, her golden eyes fixed entirely on the human. Something inside her had shifted. Small. Dangerous. The story she had heard about Deathworld humans her entire life suddenly felt incomplete. Every lesson, every warning, every military doctrine describing humans as violent animals obsessed with dominance. None of them explained why Ethan had protected a terrified child before protecting himself. One of the royal guards slowly approached the dropped pulse rifle lying across the floor. His hands still trembled. "My lady," he whispered carefully, "we should retreat to the command decks immediately." Valeth did not answer at first. Her gaze remained locked on Ethan. The human finally rose to his feet with the little girl still clinging to his arm. "Where is her mother?" he asked quietly. The child pointed weakly toward a sealed maintenance hatch farther down the corridor. "She stayed behind," the girl whispered between shaky breaths. "She told me to hide." Ethan glanced toward the dark hatchway. The ventilation shaft above it hung partially torn open, bent metal curling inward like broken claws. He already knew what that meant. Valeth stepped beside him. "Nobody goes farther into this sector," she ordered sharply. "Not until armed response teams arrive." Ethan looked at the damaged vent for another long moment before answering. "By then it will have moved again." "Then let it move," one officer snapped nervously. "This ship has 6,000 armed personnel." Ethan finally turned toward him. The red emergency lights passed slowly across the scars lining his face. "And how many of them have fought something that learns fear patterns?" Silence swallowed the corridor again. The officer looked away first. Valeth hated that she did too. Ethan gently guided the child toward one of the medics near the blast door. The little girl tightened her grip on his sleeve before finally letting go. "Are you coming back?" she asked quietly. Ethan paused. For the first time since Valeth had met him, something almost human softened his expression. "I will try." The child nodded like that answer somehow felt honest enough. Ethan turned back toward the deeper maintenance sectors and began removing his gray uniform jacket slowly, folding it once before placing it carefully on the supply crate beside the wall. Beneath it, old scars crossed his arms and shoulders in pale silver lines beneath the flashing red lights. Not random injuries. Patterns. Survival written directly into skin. One of the older officers near the rear finally stepped forward with visible hesitation. His nameplate marked him as Commander Reese Talvek, a veteran of 3 border wars. He stared at Ethan with growing disbelief. "I know you," Talvek whispered. Several officers looked toward him immediately. Talvek swallowed hard. 10 years ago, I was stationed near the Varkos arenas during the Dominion Trade Accords." Ethan said nothing. Talvek's voice became quieter, uneasier. They called him the Hollow Champion. A nervous murmur spread through the corridor. Valeth's eyes narrowed sharply. "Explain." Talvek never stopped staring at Ethan. The arenas on Varkos 9 were not normal combat pits. They used engineered predators from collapsed worlds. Nothing survived more than a few matches. His throat tightened visibly before he continued. "Except him." Ethan reached toward the black inhibitor collar around his neck again. The metal hummed softly beneath his fingertips. "Commander," Valeth said coldly, "what exactly did the Dominion place aboard my ship?" Talvek looked pale beneath the emergency lights now. "A prototype hunting organism from the Varkos breeding labs." The corridor suddenly felt colder. Even the engine vibrations beneath the floor seemed distant compared to the silence that followed. Then Talvek spoke the words that finally made every officer understand why Ethan had gone still the moment the alarms began. "My lady, that creature was designed using combat data collected from him." No one spoke after Commander Talvek's confession. The emergency lights continued pulsing across the corridor in slow waves of crimson, while the distant groaning of the ship echoed beneath their feet, like something wounded and dying inside the walls. Ethan stood perfectly still beside the maintenance hatch, his folded gray jacket resting untouched behind him on the supply crate. The black inhibitor collar around his throat hummed softly in the silence. Lady Valeth stared at him now with an expression none of her officers had ever seen before. Not anger, not authority, uncertainty. They built it from your arena records? She asked quietly. Ethan finally nodded once. Adaptation patterns, combat reflexes, threat prediction. Talvek swallowed hard before adding. The Varkos lab spent years studying survivors. They wanted to create organisms capable of hunting Deathworld species specifically. Valeth's jaw tightened beneath the red light. Without informing me. The High Council classified the project above fleet authority, Talvek answered carefully. Ethan's eyes drifted toward the dark ventilation shaft overhead again. Listening. It does not matter now, he said softly. It already learned the ship. A heavy metallic impact echoed somewhere deeper inside the lower decks, as if to confirm his words. Several officers visibly flinched. Then another alarm triggered across the corridor speakers. Warning. Structural failures detected on Deck 15. Emergency bulkheads compromised. The maintenance lights flickered violently for half a second before stabilizing again. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, calculating distance, timing, movement. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Valeth for the first time since the crisis began. You need to evacuate the civilians to upper command sectors. Valeth crossed her arms slowly beneath her dark cape. And you? Ethan glanced toward the maintenance hatch where the child's mother remained trapped somewhere beyond the damaged sectors. I know how it hunts. One of the younger officers stepped backward immediately. You cannot seriously intend to let him pursue that thing alone. Ethan answered before Valeth could speak. If large groups move through the corridors, it will follow the noise patterns. Talvek's face paled further. He is right. The older commander looked toward Valeth carefully. The organism was engineered to pressure prey into panic responses. Crowds make it more aggressive. Valeth hated how naturally everyone had begun listening to the human instead of her. Yet she hated something else even more. He had been right every single time. Another metallic groan rolled through the ventilation system overhead. Slow, deliberate. The creature was still nearby, waiting. Ethan stepped toward the maintenance hatch and reached for the manual release while beside the sealed door. Immediately, 2 royal guards raised their rifles toward him. Do not open that sector. One warned nervously. Ethan ignored them. Valeth stepped forward sharply. Stand down. The guards hesitated before slowly lowering their weapons. Ethan paused beside the hatch without looking back at her. You should not trust me this much. Valeth studied the broad scars crossing his shoulders beneath the flashing lights. Perhaps, she said quietly. But right now I trust fear less. Ethan looked at her then. Really looked at her. For a brief moment the alarms, the smoke, the tension in the corridor all seemed distant compared to the strange silence between them. Valeth realized something uncomfortable in that instant. The human did not carry himself like a slave, or a bodyguard, or even a soldier. He moved like someone who had survived too many nightmares to fear death anymore. A soft, trembling sound interrupted the moment. The little girl from earlier had approached them again, clutching Ethan's discarded jacket tightly against her chest. Please bring my mother back, she whispered. Ethan stared at the child for several long seconds. The hard lines in his face softened again in that quiet, almost invisible way Valeth was beginning to notice. He crouched slowly to her eye level. What is your name? Lyra. Ethan nodded once. Stay near the medics, Lyra. The child hesitated before holding out his folded jacket toward him. You forgot this. Ethan looked at the jacket but did not take it immediately. Instead, he gently draped it over the child's shoulders. The sleeves hung far too large. Around her tiny frame beneath the pulsing red lights. Keep it warm for me, he said softly. Something changed in the corridor after that. Even the frightened officers felt it. The human who had terrified entire arena worlds had just given his only jacket to a frightened child while preparing to walk alone into darkness. Valeth watched him rise slowly beside the sealed hatch, and for the first time in many years, the alien warlord felt ashamed of the moment she had spit in his face. The maintenance hatch opened with a long hydraulic hiss that echoed into the darkness beyond like a warning whispered through the ship itself. Cold air drifted out carrying the sharp smell of burnt wiring, machine oil, and something older beneath it all. Something organic. Ethan stepped through first without hesitation, while the red emergency lights behind him cast his shadow deep into the narrow service tunnels ahead. Pipes lined the low ceiling above him in tangled rows, dripping condensation onto the steel floor. Every few seconds, the entire passage vibrated softly beneath distant impacts somewhere inside the lower decks. Behind him, Lady Valeth ignored the protests of her officers and followed through the hatch anyway. "My lady," Commander Talvek called sharply, "you cannot enter a compromised sector." Valeth never looked back. "Then remain behind if you are afraid." The older commander fell silent immediately. Ethan stopped walking several yards into the tunnel and slowly turned toward her. "You should not be here." The faint glow from exposed conduit wiring reflected across Valeth's dark armor as she crossed her arms beneath her cape. "You are not the only one responsible for this ship." Ethan studied her quietly for a moment before continuing deeper into the maintenance sector. He did not argue again. Somehow that unsettled her more than resistance would have. The tunnel narrowed as they moved farther from the populated decks. Most of the emergency lights here had already failed, leaving long stretches of darkness broken only by weak sparks from damaged control panels. Somewhere ahead came the distant sound of metal scraping slowly against metal. Not random. Moving. Hunting. Ethan lifted one hand slightly, signaling Valeth to stop. Instantly, he crouched near the floor beside a thin trail of black fluid smeared across the steel panels. His expression hardened faintly. "It is wounded," Valeth whispered. Ethan shook his head once. "No." He touched the edge of the dark substance carefully before wiping it between his fingers. "It sheds damaged tissue to confuse tracking systems." Valeth stared at him. "How do you know that?" Ethan stood slowly beneath the flickering lights. "Because the arena handlers trained it that way." The words settled heavily between them. Ahead, another metallic sound echoed deeper in the tunnel system, followed by a faint human voice crying for help. A woman. Weak. Desperate. Valeth immediately reached for the pulse pistol at her side. Ethan did not move. "It learned mimic patterns faster than expected," he said quietly. Valeth frowned. "You think that voice is fake?" Ethan finally looked at her again. "I think the real woman stopped screaming 20 minutes ago." Silence swallowed the tunnel after that. The distant cries echoed once more through the pipes ahead. Softer now. Almost convincing. Valeth felt cold beneath her armor for the first time in years. Ethan resumed walking slowly toward the deeper sectors while steam drifted across the floor around his boots. "Why did they put you in the arenas?" she asked suddenly. Ethan remained quiet for several seconds before answering. "Debt colony draft." His voice sounded flat. "Mechanical. My family signed labor contracts on Europa Station after the famine years. The Dominion purchased the debts." Valeth's golden eyes narrowed slightly. "Purchased humans?" Ethan gave a faint, humorless smile in the darkness. "Not officially." They continued through another narrow junction lined with damaged maintenance drones frozen in place beneath blinking repair lights. Ethan's eyes constantly tracked the shadows overhead, watching every vent, every dark corner. Valeth noticed he never once walked near the center of the corridor. Always near the wall. Always calculating exits. "How long were you there?" she asked quietly. 11 years. The answer hit harder than she expected. Ethan could not have been much older than 35 now, which meant most of his life had been spent surviving inside those arenas. Ahead of them, a faint light flickered beneath a half-sealed maintenance door hanging crookedly from broken hinges. Ethan stopped immediately. Fresh claw marks stretched across the steel panels around the doorway. Long, deep. Recent. Valeth slowly raised her pistol. "Is it inside?" Ethan listened carefully to the silence beyond the door. Then something changed in his expression. Tiny. Almost invisible. Not fear. Recognition. "No," he whispered. Valeth frowned. "Then what is wrong?" Ethan's eyes lifted slowly toward the ventilation shaft directly above them. "It knows we are here now." Then every light in the tunnel went dark at once. Darkness swallowed the tunnel completely. The emergency sirens faded into distant echoes while only the low mechanical heartbeat of the Obsidian Crown remained beneath their feet. For one long second, neither Ethan nor Lady Valeth moved. Then a soft click came from somewhere inside the darkness ahead of them. Metal shifting against metal. Slow. Careful. Hunting. Valeth raised her pulse pistol instinctively, but Ethan's hand immediately closed gently around the barrel and lowered it toward the floor. "No sudden light," he whispered. His voice was so calm it somehow made the darkness feel worse. Valeth could barely see him now. Only the faint outline of his shoulders beneath weak sparks leaking from damaged conduit panels farther down the corridor. "If it can see in the dark," she whispered back, "then why does light matter?" Ethan tilted his head slightly, listening to the tunnel around them. "Because panic changes breathing patterns." Another metallic scrape drifted overhead inside the ventilation shaft. Closer now. Valeth slowly realized she could hear it moving through the walls around them. Not charging. Circling. Studying. Her pulse quickened despite herself. Ethan noticed immediately. "Slow your breathing." She hated that she obeyed him. Somewhere behind them, a distant emergency light flickered weakly for half a second before dying again. The brief flash illuminated the corridor just enough for Valeth to see fresh claw marks carved across the walls around them. Long black grooves stretching almost 8 feet high. Then darkness returned. Ethan's voice stayed low. "It uses fear response to map movement." Valeth tightened her grip on the pistol. "You speak about it like a soldier." "No," Ethan answered softly. "Like prey." Silence followed. Then the sound came again. A faint human voice somewhere deeper in the tunnel. Weak. Crying. "Help me." Valeth felt cold run through her chest. The voice sounded exactly like the trapped woman from earlier. Ethan did not react at all. "It learned emotional mimicry from arena crowds," he said quietly. "The handlers rewarded it whenever fear levels increased." Valeth stared into the darkness ahead. "Your people created this." Ethan remained silent for several seconds before answering. "No, your people funded it." Before Valeth could respond, a low vibration rolled through the floor beneath them. Different from before. Rhythmic. Mechanical. Ethan immediately grabbed her arm and pulled her sideways against the wall just as a maintenance drone burst through the darkness ahead, sparks flying from its damaged chassis as it crashed into the corridor floor and skidded past them. Something had torn through the machine's steel shell like paper. The drone's optical display flickered weakly beside them. One final line of text blinked across the cracked screen before dying completely. Motion detected. Human pattern prioritized. Valeth looked toward Ethan slowly. "It is hunting you specifically." Ethan's expression never changed. That was always the point. Another sound echoed overhead. Not scraping this time. Breathing. Deep. Heavy. Directly above them. Valeth slowly raised her eyes toward the darkness in the ventilation shaft overhead. Something enormous shifted behind the metal grating. She could not clearly see it. Only movement. Massive. Patient. Watching them without sound. Her finger tightened on the trigger instinctively. Ethan gently lowered the weapon again. "Do not fire unless it commits." "Commits," Valeth whispered in disbelief. Ethan's eyes never left the vent above them. "It likes." Hesitation. The metal grating bent inward slightly with a low creak. Valeth's pulse hammered painfully now despite every attempt to stay calm. Yet beside her, Ethan stood perfectly still. No fear in his breathing. No panic in his eyes. Just exhaustion and focus sharpened into something almost inhuman. Then the creature suddenly moved away through the vents with terrifying speed, vanishing deeper into the ship again. Silence rushed back into the corridor. Valeth let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Why did it leave? Ethan stared into the darkness ahead. Because it already found a better target. At that exact moment, the ship-wide communication system crackled violently back to life through hidden speakers above them. Commander Talvek's voice exploded through the tunnel, filled with panic. "My lady, the civilian evacuation convoy on deck 12 has gone missing." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Not frustration. Not anger. Grief. When he opened them again, something colder had settled there. "It is hurting them now," he said quietly. "Just like the arenas taught it to do." The upper civilian sectors of the Obsidian Crown had once been quiet transport halls lined with silver lighting and observation windows overlooking the stars beyond Caro's prime. Now they looked like the inside of a dying machine. Emergency bulkheads hung half-closed across smoke-filled corridors while abandoned supply carts and scattered luggage blocked the pathways toward the evacuation docks. The low pulse of warning sirens echoed endlessly through the ship, like a mechanical heartbeat, slowing toward death. Ethan and Lady Valeth moved through the ruined corridor side by side beneath flickering red lights. Neither spoke. Somewhere ahead, Dozens of frightened civilians remained trapped in the dark with a creature designed from 11 years of one human being's suffering. Ethan could hear them before he saw them, whispering, crying, trying desperately not to make noise. The evacuation convoy had barricaded itself inside docking chamber 14 behind a sealed cargo gate reinforced with emergency welds. Through the thick steel door came the soft, trembling sounds of families holding each other in silence. Valeth activated the control panel beside the entrance. "Open the gate," she ordered. A terrified voice answered through the intercom immediately. "No, it is outside." Ethan stepped closer to the speaker. "It followed you here?" Silence answered him at first. Then a frightened civilian whispered, "It is waiting." Ethan slowly looked upward toward the dark observation windows stretching above the docking chamber entrance. Beyond the glass, endless stars drifted cold and silent around the burning moon below. Then he saw it, a faint reflection moving across the black glass overhead. Watching the barricade from outside the chamber, Valeth followed his gaze and froze. The creature remained mostly hidden in darkness beyond the observation frame, but its silhouette moved with horrible patience against the stars. Not attacking, studying, hurting them exactly as Ethan predicted. "Open the door now," Ethan said quietly into the intercom, "and stay away from the windows." The cargo gate slowly began to unlock with heavy mechanical groans. The moment the seal opened, Ethan stepped inside the chamber and immediately pressed the emergency override beside the wall. Massive steel shutters slammed down over every observation window 1 second before something enormous struck the outer glass from the darkness beyond. The impact thundered through the entire docking chamber. Civilians screamed. Several children burst into tears. The steel shutters bent inward slightly beneath another heavy strike from outside. Ethan moved calmly through the panic toward the center of the chamber. "Everyone away from the walls," he ordered. His voice was not loud. Somehow people obeyed anyway. Valeth stared at him in disbelief as frightened civilians instinctively gathered closer around the human instead of the armed Dominion soldiers. Another impact slammed against the outer shutters. Dust rained from the ceiling. Ethan finally reached up toward the black inhibitor collar around his throat once more. This time his hand did not hesitate. Valeth watched his fingers rest against the control seal for several long seconds. "If I remove this," he said quietly, "your soldiers may panic more than the civilians." Another deafening impact shook the chamber. One section of the outer shutter split open just enough for cold starlight to spill through the crack. Something moved behind it. Fast. Massive. Watching them through the opening, Valeth looked toward her officers. Fear was already spreading across their faces. Not because of the creature anymore. Because of Ethan. Slowly, the alien warlord stepped toward him beneath the flashing emergency lights. Her golden eyes met his gray ones in silence. Then, in front of every soldier and civilian inside the chamber, Lady Valeth reached up with her own hands and deactivated the inhibitor collar around the human's throat. The black metal unlocked with a soft mechanical click before falling into Ethan's palm. Silence consumed the room. No alarms. No screams. Only the distant sound of metal groaning beneath the creature's weight outside the chamber walls. Ethan looked down at the collar resting in his scarred hand for a long moment. 11 years of cages. Arenas. Chains. Fear. Then he quietly set the device on the floor beside him. Valeth took one slow step backward. Not from fear. Respect. Another violent impact split the outer shutter wider as freezing starlight flooded into the chamber. Civilians cried out in terror. Ethan simply rolled his shoulders once beneath the red lights and looked toward the darkness beyond the breach. Calm. Exhausted. Human. Valeth's voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke again. "Forgive us." Ethan never looked away from the stars outside. "Just protect the civilians," he answered softly. Then he walked toward the breach alone while the entire chamber watched in complete silence. And for the first time in her life, Lady Valeth understood why the galaxy feared Deathworld humans so much. It was never because they survived monsters. It was because even after becoming monsters themselves, some of them still chose mercy.